Hey everybody, I am so glad to see such a great turnout on a pretty chilly, windy night. So total kudos to you and thank you. I'm Molly Bao. I am one of the now more than 100 volunteers working to make this festival happen. We're a scrappy group. We all volunteer on night and weekends, and we are trying to pull off something pretty big. And I'm gonna tell you about that in just a second. But first, I'm gonna say thank you so much to NYU. You guys are rock stars. Tom, we really appreciate your hospitality. To Nova Friends and Refugees, to Georgetown Episcopal Church, St. George's Episcopal Church. They're gonna talk to me about saying Georgetown. Sorry about that, guys. This was a group effort to pull this together. And to the businesses who are on the right side of this cultural moment and donated the wine, the baklava, the delicious hummus, and all the goodness that you had. Thank you so much for supporting us. Now, I'm gonna get started by a quick show of hands. Who has been to a One Journey event before? Raise your hand. Okay, I'm not so good with math. I'm from Louisiana. That's about half. So for those of you who didn't raise your hand, here's a quick primer, and here's the so what, why you should care. And for those of you who raised your hand, here's some pithy talking points that you can tell your friends and family to get them to care. So the One Journey Festival started as a direct response to the backlash that we have been seeing about the global refugee crisis. The hate, the anger, the fear, the confusion that casts refugees as job-stealing, culture-crushing outsiders who are burdens on society. We're a direct response to that. We're trying to change the narrative. We are trying to shift the conversation and engage people about the courage and the contributions that these amazing people who are gritty, who are resilient, bring to our communities. We're trying to change the conversation, but we're also trying to start a movement. This isn't just about one day, one flash in the pan event. We are trying to, through outreach and engagement with other cities, create this festival elsewhere to start the conversation that drives to action, that results in a warm embrace of people who really do bring more to our communities, to ourselves. So that's what One Journey is about. And we're not doing it just through talk, through pictures. We're doing it through engagement. We are throwing a wicked awesome festival on June 2nd. I hope you can all make it. It's going to be an outdoor party all day that celebrates music, dance, art, food, and fashion brought to you by refugees who are incredible artists, painters, musicians, and they have so much talent. We're gonna bring the community together to see that, to touch that, to be a part of that. And I hope you can join us. We also have a series of events. This is the third of our final film screenings. We've had a series of really great conversations, and we're gonna have a good one tonight. We've got another wonderful event on March 23rd. You're welcome to pull out your phones right there and write that down, March 23rd. It's gonna be great. That's all right, I'll wait. That's cool, I'll wait. March 23rd, it's gonna be a brilliant gala, and we are going to have some incredible speakers. The Jordanian ambassador, the founder of Falafel Inc. We've got a phenomenal voice who's a former refugee who is just, she works for the Malala Fund. She's absolutely brilliant. So we hope you can make it out for that. And if you can't make it, come and join us. We've got lots of volunteer activities, things that you can tangibly do to take action in your community now to start being a part of the solution and the conversation. So that's what we've got going. I also hope that we put a PowerPoint up here in a second and I can show you how to maybe financially get involved if you feel so compelled. Because we, after all, are throwing a festival as scrappy volunteers and would love your support. And so we've got some wonderful text to donate opportunities. You may have seen them on some of the signs. At some point, I will show you this here, but I'll show it to you at the end of the program. So plenty of opportunities on CrowdRise, on our website to get involved. And if you want to volunteer, we'd love that too. And tweet about us. Let us know. Help amplify our voice at One Journey Fest if you're a Twitter fan, and you are more than welcome to keep your phones out during this event. I strongly encourage social media tweeting and posting while we're having this conversation. So let me go ahead and kick this event off by bringing up our moderator. Haiti Adams Fitzpatrick is a phenomenal journalist. She is from South Africa. She cut her teeth in local media, and then she hopped to global journalism as a foreign correspondent for France 24, where she covered a whole host of things. She's done everything from the Cape Town gang riots to covering the Oscars. So she's done it, she's seen it all. She cares deeply about social justice issues, and she's gonna navigate us through this conversation tonight. So I'll bring her up and let her tell you more about what we're gonna do. Thanks.
Thank you, Molly. And let me just say off the bat, covering the Oscars is way different than being at the Oscars. It's not all it's cracked up to be. I was listening to Molly earlier, and I was so inspired when you said you're a scrappy bunch of volunteers doing this. Thank you for doing that, because, I've never been a refugee in my life, but I grew up under apartheid, and people in my community were forcibly removed from their homes, thrown onto the worst real estate in the country, and told, hey, you live here, no sewage, no social services, no real homes to speak of, basically the ghetto. You live there and make the best of it. And I grew up and I lived through the consequences of that, through the violence, through the poverty. But all of that came to an end politically because there were people who spoke for me. People I will never meet, people who are dead now, some who are still around, people I would never be able to thank. And so I thank all of you for being here as someone who's needed a voice in her life. And I thank all of you who volunteer and who give your time, who do this for a living, because I know that people who have this, I know from my own experience, I know what it's like to feel the sense of dispossession, the sense of displacement, and you always need someone to speak for you. So on behalf of someone who's kind of been there, thank you very much. But tonight our focus here is on the 99% of displaced persons and refugees who do not resettle. The global statistics are frightening, but they're real, because we have to remember that beyond the numbers are real lives, real people. There are as many stories about refugees and displaced persons as there are refugees and displaced people. This is not a refugee crisis, it is a human crisis, it is a global crisis. Around the world, 65 million people are displaced, and more than half of them are under the age of 18. The number of displaced people right now is higher than ever and surpassing World War II numbers. 24 people are forcibly displaced every minute as a result of conflict or persecution. And of the more than 17 million refugees tracked by the UN High Commission for Refugees in 2016, less than 1% were resettled that year. 2017 saw 10.3 million newly displaced people. And it is important to remember that there is a difference between refugees and internally displaced people, or IDPs. Refugees are those who have been forced to leave due to a natural disaster, people who have had to escape war or persecution. IDPs are people who've had to leave their homes but have not crossed an international frontier, have not left for another country. I wonder how many of us in this room have ever thought about what life really is like inside a refugee camp. I don't know, but I have thought about it. Think of the arduous journey, being deprived of basic resources, the loss of loved ones, seeing your community torn apart, seeing your culture torn apart, thrown by the wayside. I always say, if you take away someone's language, if you take away their culture, you take away their dignity. So think of those whose dignity has been stolen by all of this. Think of the overcrowding. Think of living your life in limbo. Think of what it's like to be in housing that's meant to be temporary, but it's now permanent. And what many people probably do not realize is that developing regions in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East, the poorest and often most unstable countries, they host 84% of the world's refugees. And currently in this very charged political climate, we see this nativist backlash and its very, very real consequences. Reduced refugee admittance, dwindling resettlement agency support. So now more than ever, it is important for us to stay focused, to stay steadfast, and not just be overwhelmed by the statistics. It is important for those of us who advocate for the displaced, for refugees, to keep raising awareness of this crisis, because that's how we help others move from awareness to understanding, to empathy, and to action. And we're about to show you a very real first-hand account of life inside a refugee camp, after which I will invite our speakers, our panelists, to the stage for discussion about the film and the broader 99%. Now, the award-winning documentary Salam Neighbor follows two filmmakers who fully embed themselves in a Syrian refugee camp. They're chronicling the lives of their displaced neighbors and provide an intimate look at the world's most dire humanitarian crisis. This film and the campaign to connect the world to refugees was created by the first filmmakers allowed to be registered and given a tent inside the refugee camp. I think that's pretty awesome. We'd like to thank St. George's Episcopal Church and NYU DC for making this film screening possible tonight. And unlike in most movie theaters, we're going to encourage you to take your phones out. Keep them out during the screening. Post to social media your thoughts, your impressions, and you can see the hashtags behind me. Are they behind me? No. Okay, well, they're supposed to be behind me. I don't know what they are. But I'm sure One Journey Fest, hashtag One Journey Fest, and we encourage you to post, share, engage with your friends, engage with the people who work in your space, and use your preferred platform. Ladies and gentlemen, Salam Neighbor.
So we have an amazing panel. We were supposed to be three panelists, but we're down to two this evening. And I'm going to ask them to come up here and take their seats. And we're going to unpack a little bit of this film and their impressions. I'd like to introduce them to you first. Over there to the far left is Mike Nikonchuk. He's a senior researcher at the Beyond Conflict Innovation Lab, where he specializes in the science of trauma, social belonging and exclusion, and violence prevention. Now, his work shapes institutions' responses to a variety of social conflict and justice issues, including the Syrian refugee crisis, counterterrorism and countering violent extremism, as well as racial tensions inside the United States. And previously, Mike worked as an emergency response coordinator for Quest Scope in Jordan, where he oversaw 3 humanitarian aid projects in Zadri refugee camp, the camp we just saw portrayed in tonight's film. There he assisted more than 1,500 youth through peer-to-peer mentoring, psychosocial support, and restorative justice programs. Janella Nelson is the Senior Education Technical Advisor for Child Fund International, providing technical assistance in education and protection to 22 countries. Previously, she was the Education Program Manager for the Norwegian Refugee Council. My little teleprompter is letting me down here. In South Sudan, and from 2009 to early 2012, and in Eastern Chad in 2006 to 2007. And there she developed education and livelihood programs for refugees and returning refugees. Prior to NRC, Janella worked for Plan International, World Learning. She was also the technical advisor to the National Equity Committee in Guinea on girls' education. She's also been a teacher for refugees here in the United States. Someone who's not with us this evening, we had hoped to have Sayar Nice. She's the Sayar Nice, I believe, is the executive director of Talent Beyond Boundaries. She's not feeling well, so we wish her the best. And we're going to continue our discussion. I'll move over here. Janella, Mike, thank you very much for being here with us. Mike, I'm going to start with you. You worked on the ground at the Zadri refugee camp in Jordan, helping as an emergency response coordinator. How does this film track with your experience? Was this an accurate depiction of what you saw?
Yeah, of course. Zatari has changed so much over the years that it's been around, years longer than it should be around. You know, Chris and Zach came at an interesting time in the camp's development when it was really transitioning from tents, tents with a TS and tents with an SE in many ways, and moving towards something more regulated, more formal. One time I was sitting in Zatari, and before 2014 it was a lot easier to sleep in the camp. So one night some friends and I were staying in my friend Abdullah's tent, and we were watching Jurassic Park. And there's a line in Jurassic Park when, a quite famous line when he says, "Life finds a way." And I think Chris and Zach capture that really neatly in the film. Life does find a way. And they reiterated that over and over again, that people from Syria, they are ibda'in, they call it, they're innovators. And they always have and always will be. And they built the city out of nothing. Even
Right, that was one of my favorite lines. We were building a camp, but they were building a city.
From day one, you know, the second day that Zatari existed, when there was maybe 2,000 people in the camp, there was this little boy named Ahmed, about Abdurraouf's age, and I saw him coming back in under this barbed wire fence. And I said, "Habibi, ta'al, come here, what are you doing?" He said, he had 2 bags in his hands. One was full of cigarettes, the Al-Hamra brand, which is the most disgusting cigarette you'll ever smoke, but it's very famous in Syria, and then a bag of tomatoes. I said, "Where'd you get those?" He said, "From the border. My uncle met me there last night." I said, "Okay. And what are you doing with them here?" He said, "Well, Baba's going to sell them." "Why?" "Because no one will smoke Marlboros here, and Jordanian tomatoes are not as good as Syrian tomatoes, obviously." So from day 2, that's how the internal economy in the camp started, to now pumping out multi-million dollars a day. And until 2014, actually as an aid worker, you would have to exchange your Jordanian dinar for Syrian lira if you wanted to spend any money in the camp, because the entire internal economy was run on the Syrian lira, because people brought cash with them, their savings that they had. You know, for me, in seeing that, a lot has changed. In Zatari last month, you now see there's no more tents. It's all those plastic caravans donated mostly by countries from the Gulf. They finally have built a sewage system, and one of the main reasons they had to do that is because Zatari sits over a lot of aquifers, and there was a huge risk of groundwater pollution. And another thing, obviously, is that the electricity situation has changed. You know, it's standard UN policy, you don't electrify refugee camps. But the nature and the demographic background of Syrian refugees sort of flipped the whole system, because they weren't used to refugees that was sort of a non-negotiable. You know, we need electricity, what about my iPhone? You know, and I would be mocked for having an iPhone 3. These guys are having 5, 6. And UNHCR was racking up an electric bill of almost $1 million dinar a month because all the wires in the camp were pirated, and they showed them on the ground. Because the wires that they would pirate, that young kid Ahmed, he used to work in electricity. I would see him climbing these ladders up to the top of these poles that connected electricity between the police stations. And he'd run a wire down into the tent so that Baba could have his TV, so that Mama and his sister could charge their phones. And the problem was that in the winter, a lot of those wires would fall and they would electrify puddles and kids would get electrocuted. So eventually the UN had to do something about the electrification situation and move towards eventually a solar grid model, which they just opened about 3 months ago or 6 months ago. And you know, the last thing I'll say is that of course there's hope, and of course things have improved infrastructurally, but people still can't leave the camp without permits. They have to have a reason to be leaving the camp, and you have to wait about 6 hours to apply for a 48-hour leave permit. And if you're not back within 48 hours, you're at risk of detention and, if not that, deportation summarily. And there was a young man in the video, you know, I won't share his name, but he appeared quite a bit in the video sitting next to Chris and Zach. And he lost his job with one of those NGOs because grant cycles for these NGOs run 1 to 2 years, and donors get bored after about year 5, if that long. And so a lot of the projects featured here have closed because donors are now on to something else, and there's fatigue of giving money to the same crisis. And he needed a job desperately because also the WFP has cut their salaries, the basic income of 20 dinar a month they give to residents of the camp. He needed a job. If you work illegally outside the camp, you have a high risk if you're caught of being deported back to Syria, because don't forget, Jordan's not party to certain conventions on the rights of refugees. And so he eventually found a job as a seasonal worker on a farm in Ajloun, outside of the camp. The man who ran this farm had a very different intention for this young man. And about a week after working, let's call him Ahmed. Ahmed was sleeping, and he heard some rustling, and he woke up and he saw that the farm owner was in his room, and he tried to play it off and said, "What are you doing?" The guy said, "No, don't worry, I was just checking something." So Ahmed goes back to sleep. The next day he realizes that his passport is gone. So this farm owner had taken his passport and forced Ahmed to work for a month and a half as a slave on his farm, because he said, "If you report this, I'll say that you were working illegally and I'll get you deported back to Syria." He has 3 little girls, Riham, Siham, and one other on the way, actually. That's 7 years into a war, and a guy is being basically enslaved. That's 7 years into a conflict, and the camps were supposed to protect people. The system is broken. Yes, it does some beautiful things, and it has opportunities for instilling tremendous hope, but it is not enough, and it is broken. And it isn't meant to last 10 years. People aren't designed to suffer for 10 years either, but they still are. So while there's so many good things that have changed, some things have gotten far worse. So it's a...
I want to give Janella just a chance to speak, but
Please.
I want to come back to what you said about the system being broken, and we'll get back to that. Janella, you've worked in Africa, in refugee camps there. How does your experience there compare with what you've seen here this evening?
Well, my experience in the camps in eastern Chad, which were on the border of Darfur, as well as working with returning refugees in South Sudan who had been in refugee camps in Kenya, Uganda, and Ethiopia, are somewhat similar. In eastern Chad, where I lived just 3 miles away from 2 of the refugee camps, and in a hut, there were days that I was not able to continue to go to the refugee camp because of security. That we would get to the camp and that we'd be told on the way to the camp that we would have to return back because there had been a raid on the camp by rebels. Because the borders were so porous that rebel groups would come in out of Chad back into Sudan, and they would be recruiting children from the camps. And they would also be looting the camps. So the issue about security really resonated with me because of the fact that that was a serious issue. In addition to the fact in Chad, in eastern Chad, like here, there are no trees around, but there wasn't gas stoves there in eastern Chad. And so the only way to be able to make fire was to find some kind of wood, some kind of bush. And so women, usually young women, would go around the camps to try to find wood and to try to make fires, and it would be a real security risk. They would be abducted or raped or attacked, and sometimes by Chadians, sometimes by rebel forces. And so then what one of the organizations decided to support the refugees to be able to plant seedlings. And I think that all of us that worked there in the camp thought, well, this is a good idea. Why wouldn't it be a good idea? It seemed that it wasn't going to be a short-term solution for many of the refugees, that they were going to be there for some time. But the whole camp exploded. People were so angry, and they refused to plant these trees. And many of us didn't understand why. But in speaking to the teachers and the students that I was working with at the time, they did come forth and say, well, we only plant trees because that's where we plant our roots. Why would we plant trees here? We don't want to stay here. This is not our home. So just that concept of always that hope of returning back. And those camps in Chad have been around for 20 years. And as they said in the movie, 17 years is the average time that somebody is, that refugees or IDPs are displaced. And that is the case with the refugees that I work with in Chad, as well as in South Sudan. That they were not displaced for a few years. They were displaced for 10, 14, 18 years. And that is a generation who has their culture, their identity, as well as their education has all been compromised. And so also the discussion about education, that is very important. In most refugee camps, because donors focus so heavily on primary school, which is very important, but there's no transition into secondary school. So the majority of camps don't have secondary education that is offered for children. And then, as they said, how are they going to return to their country and rebuild their country when they don't have secondary education offered, or much less higher education and access to higher education?
You know, my takeaway from this crisis has always been two things. Nobody asks to be a refugee. Nobody asks to be displaced. And at the end of the day, people just want to go back home. That's all. Sometimes I think there's this misconception that everybody wants to make it to Europe. Everybody's dream is to make it to the United States. No, people just, I remember a Zimbabwean woman. In South Africa, we have many, many refugees pouring into the country. And I spoke to a Zimbabwean woman, and there was a Somali woman, and they had been victims of xenophobic attacks. And she said, we don't want to be here. If I was going to die, I would rather die in my own country than come this far only to die in a place I don't know. And that is part of it. Like people are away from home, their dignity. I always think when you take away someone's dignity, what is left to live for? So in terms of our response, could you tell me, Mike, what you, in your experience and in your opinion, what do you think as countries, as host countries, as developed countries, what are we doing right in our response, and what are we doing wrong?
One thing, like you said, is the assumption that everyone wants to come here. A lot of us don't want to be here. A lot of us are scared to be here. No, this young guy named Alauddin in Zatari, I said, if you could go anywhere, where would you go? He said, probably Canada, because no offense to you, but I don't want to get shot in a mall. You know, it's tough that is tough to hear. But it's not just a perspective or a debate we have about ourselves. It's something global. You know, we do some things right. I'm speaking in terms of the Western world in general. There's some great and innovative resettlement schemes. In Canada, they have a private sponsorship scheme. They have a system where non-governmental and even non-NGO institutions like churches or community groups can sponsor refugees. They have a long backlog, but a family reunification system. Germany has a solid family reunification system. And those are countries that also give a basic income when you're an asylum seeker. Unlike the US, it's state by state, but you're generally expected to be self-sufficient from the moment you get here. And at the same time, we don't provide adequate services, and then we expect gratitude. Why? It baffles me that we expect gratitude from someone who we're scared of them. I mean, all those boys and young men who bent over backwards to help Chris and Zach, who were sitting on the side, set up their tent, basically filming in like a zoo project. If we want to film, the fact that we have to make immersive documentaries is sad, right? That maybe people will care if they see two white kids going through this. Step one, you know, and then there's also, of course, the fact that, you know, we expect people to want to come here and then be grateful with what they're given, and it's tough because it's, of course, doing something good, and resettlement programs are fantastic opportunities for people. But a good friend of mine, Abdullah, he had an opportunity to go to Canada, and he still does, and he's really, really scared because he said, I don't know how to raise my young boy, Majid, as anything other than a boy from Damascus. I don't know how to raise a Canadian, and if he's 3 years old and goes to Canada, English will be better than his Arabic. He won't know how to write Arabic. The stuff that my dad did to raise me, to discipline me, won't apply. I feel like I'll be a bad father if I have to raise my boy in the West. But at the same time, if I go back to Syria, I'll probably get arrested or killed. So do I risk not being the father I want, or risk not being a father at all? Now, those are the decisions people are making. It's not, oh, I just wait till the West opens up their doors for me. It's a much more nuanced and complex decision than that.
And fear plays such a big role, not just on the part of refugees, but on the part of citizens in many host countries in the West. What has been your experience?
Well, my experience in working in camps is that, yes, there is, I think, organizations like this, that's what I just talked about, of trying to get refugees to plant seedlings. I think there's many, many good intentions, and sometimes they go sour. But I do think that there is many organizations that are dedicated to this work and who do use the knowledge that is coming from the refugees to improve the situation of refugees in those camps, looking at the culture and seeing how can we support children better to be able to go to school, and how can we support children and families through, to receive some kind of psychological first aid, but using culture, using religion, using their faith to be able to get there. So I do think that there are promising practices that are being used, but it is true, and even the UNHCR representative said this, all of the organizations that do this, they're supposed to be doing it short term. I mean, if you've ever lived in a prefab, the ones, it's like a container, that's a short-term solution. It cooks you like a microwave. And it's very cold when it's cold. So this is a short-term solutions, but that's where, we have to look beyond that and see what can we do specifically with host governments. Because host governments also, when you work for an organization, and in these settings, you have to abide by the rules of the host government. And if the host government doesn't want those refugees, those rules are going to be very strict. And those rules are not going to be conducive to enhancing the environment or the skills of refugees. As was stated, Mike said that the refugees can't leave the camps. In Kakuma camp, which is one of the largest camps in Kenya, they have Sudanese refugees as well as other refugees, Southern Sudanese refugees. My colleagues from South Sudan who live there, one of my colleagues, Moses, who was there for 14 years, he said that he knew that he could go to Nairobi, the capital, and get work and do something, but he knew he would be arrested. So people couldn't travel outside of the camps. And then in addition to that, you have in Eastern Chad, we had a colleague that worked for us as a refugee. He was a refugee in the camp, but in Sudan, in Darfur, he had been a professional. He had had work, he had gone to university in Khartoum, and he is now in a refugee camp. But we had to pay him a wage that was less than he would get as a teacher than what he would get if he distributed food by the UN. And that's because that we also were abide by the rules that there are in each of these camps that are put forward by the host government. So that's one thing that's, in working with host governments, for example, to ensure that they recognize, or that the government, the government where the refugees are coming from, recognize the diplomas that children receive. All of these things are things that we still are struggling with, and we've been doing this for years, but we still haven't gotten there.
And staying with the children, I couldn't help but wonder throughout this film, what kind of world are we creating? What kind of adults will these children turn out to be? Will they be angry? Will they be bitter? Will they be resilient enough to see the good in this world? What kind of human beings are we creating in these refugee camps or in these war-torn situations? And I looked at these kids who never get a mental break, as they said in the film. They never get a mental break from this war. What's the most heart-stopping story for you in your work in that camp?
Probably two stand out. One is my friend's son, who came to the camp when he was about 6 months old. One thing that sets him apart from children who are about 2 or 3 years older than him in some of these child-friendly programs where they do art therapy and whatnot, he doesn't know how to draw trees, right? Because he's never seen one, because he can't leave. So all the trees you see are ones from cartoons. ones that are big, colorful, fluffy. They're not real trees. People choose to draw with different colors than they did when they first came to the camp because people are used to plastic shipping containers and dirty streets, so it's all browns and yellows, and it's just remarkably sad. Another thing that stood out, I mean, look at what Raouf responded to. He responded what he needed. The space where his mind could even begin to learn was in the safety he felt in his relationship with those kids. So creating, not just getting butts in chairs in schools because you should, but figuring out how someone whose school was bombed, what does that child need to be able to learn again at the most basic level? And it might be a little bit of love first. How do you design a program around that? How do you convince a donor that restoration of relationships is a primary cornerstone of education more than getting booked somewhere? How do you do that? And very, very lastly, another really poignant thing they said in the film was how everything lies under the surface. Last month when I was in Zatari, a friend of mine, we were cooking dinner together, cooking galayat bandora. For those of you who know galayat bandora, it's very, very tasty. And we're cooking in one of those big red Tefal pots that they showed a lot in there. And we're stirring, and he says, you know what this pot reminds me of? And I was like, no. He says, this is the exact same kind of pots they kept the heads in. And then he just goes back to chopping more garlic. It's bizarre, and it's constant, and it's so abnormal, but it is so normalized. Because this was someone who had been in prison and tortured. And that's not a flashback that you should get while making dinner, no matter what stage of life you're in, no matter what stage of the resettlement or healing process you're in. So the low-grade normalcy of terrible things.
Desensitization.
Yeah, and desensitization, but also what does that mean that's going on inside of a person internally, biologically, psychologically? So.
Well, I think there's a few. I mean, for me, one of the things that's different about the experience that I had in camps was, you know, Jordan is a different country than Chad. And in Chad, where I was working, it was really in the middle of nowhere, in the Sahel Desert, closer to Libya. And so there wasn't a lot of food. There wasn't a lot of food for those of us who were humanitarian aid workers at the time. And one of the things that I remembered was when we were having focus group discussions with women, talking to them about their experience, youth, and the education program. Afterwards, there was a little shop in the camp where they sold rice and beans. And there really was no food. And so we ordered rice and beans for all the women that were there. And it was about 30 women or so. But within seconds, there was like 50 women who were eating around these 3-4 plates. And I was really humbled, and I had to look away because I just realized I had never seen hunger like that before. And it really stayed with me that these people were very hungry. They just did not have the food in the camps. And then another thing is I think it's important to know that refugees sometimes go in and out of the flux of being a refugee. I had a coworker, or a colleague of mine in South Sudan who had been a refugee for 11 years. Then she was able to move back to her home country of South Sudan when there was peace in 2010, after they received independence. And now she's a refugee again, Grace. And she's now had children who are refugees because of the conflict continuing. And this is the experience of many refugees, that they think that it's over and then they have to return. And the last one is that in the camp in Chad, there was an incredible resilience, one that I had just never seen before. And there were 2 teachers who had a 5th grade education, and that was the highest education that we could find. They became teachers in our camp, or in our program. They had met, they had married, and during the time they were there, they had a baby. And my last week there, there was the test for them to be able to be teachers. And the woman had just given birth 2 days before, but she came to that exam, sat on a dirt floor with her newborn, and took the test. And they had named the baby Ilham, which means inspiration. And many years later, I was able to find out that Ilham was now in school. And that was when she was 6, but now she's 11. And we believe she's still in the camp.
Wow. I'd like to open the discussion up to anyone in the audience who'd like to ask a question. We've got about 7 minutes, so we have time for 2 questions and 1.5 answers, or 1.5 questions and 2. The lady over there, thank you. I think there's a microphone for you. If you could just give your name, your last name, and who you'd like to direct the question to.
My name is Maya Ormsby, and I'm a board president for an organization that provides digital or virtual education for refugees. My question is about education, but actually for both of you, because what we've heard about the Connected Learning Consortium, specifically for the camps that you mentioned in Chad and in Kenya, actually, sorry, in Kenya and Zatari camp. And it's a higher education, college level education, when they take lessons via Skype, some kind of virtually, and then university professors come to the camp to take exams in the camp. And there are also facilitators in the camp. And I'm thinking about this in reference to some of the exceptionally smart and well-educated refugees who reside in the camp. And I'm thinking about their opportunities as well. So like we can't forget them too, because they could become leaders of their societies. So what is the status? Where is it? What's happening with this project? The Connected Learning Consortium, University of Geneva, University of Kent, Jesuit University, I think they were involved in this.
Mike, Janelle, who wants to?
I mean, I know there are a lot of digital education opportunities now in Kakuma camp. I know that in fact, I was just recently in a conversation with a Columbia University Teachers College, as well as IRC, who's in the show, about digital education for refugees. And we're looking at secondary education, distance learning, as well as higher education. But I think there's a lot of challenges with that. And one of them I found in Chad, we did have a secondary education program we started, but it was a distance learning program. And so, maybe it could be possible that they come in to take the exams, but I think all of us know, to be able to go to secondary school or to get a higher education, unless you're really focused, it's very hard to do that on your own. So that's what we struggled with, and that's some of the discussions right now in terms of what kind of platforms need to be available for refugees, and how can we ensure that they're recognized if they do get a degree. Where is it going to be recognized? And that's an ongoing discussion right now in the education sector and in emergencies.
And very briefly, and NRC has been leading the way in a lot of this higher education, online higher education. There's a lot going on in that space right now, but there's some major challenges in Zatari and elsewhere, and even for refugees that resettle in Western countries. Because in a place like Germany, where we also have an office, you can have a college degree, but if you decided to go back and get an online degree in social work, Germany says, well, what other qualifications do you have? What professional certifications? Your degree was in English. There's 1,000 questions that states and job market will ask you, irrespective of your degree. And in Jordan specifically, there's a huge question of why bother? Even if I study the degree I want, I still can't get a job or a work permit in any advanced sector in the country. So why? You have to have a really strong internal drive and sort of deep philosophical reason for wanting to get the degree, because there's really limited utility for it in country.
Do we have time for one more question? One more very, very quick question, which only one of our panelists will be able to answer.
Hi, my name is Dina, and I have a question about the future of camps like Zatari. As a Palestinian, it's very easy for me to compare camps like Zatari to the early stages of Palestinian refugee camps that were established after the Nakba in Lebanon, which has been about 70 years now. Studying the Palestinian refugee camps, you see the transition of the camps to structures more similar to like a smaller village or even a city. Do you foresee Zatari transitioning to this type of structure?
A lot, but I'm happy.
I don't know Zatari
Okay.
camp.
I mean, of course I see it taking that direction. Just the time frame is a big question. I mean, the politics of a refugee camp in Jordan is particularly complicated given its history of having places like Mukhayyim Begaa, Mukhayyim Hussa, and other Palestinian camps that did look a lot like Zatari did in the 60s and 70s. But there's a couple of sort of geographic questions as well. In Lebanon, places like Sabr and Shatila are really close to Beirut and always were. So as urbanization took place in the capital, it sort of naturally engulfed those camps. Whereas Mafra is the nearest city, and Mafra is not growing at the rate of a city like Amman because it's quite small. It's only about 35,000 people. So I think that the timeline and the trajectory will be different, but slowly you even see Ministry of Interior policies changing to allow things that look more like permanent structures to be built inside of Zatari. It's a time frame question, and I think the big nut to crack is still labor market integration, because it's really hard to have even a quasi-urban feel if people don't have the right to work in sectors that they choose.
I think we are out of time. I wish we had more time to discuss this, but I really want to say thank you very much to Mike Nikonchak and Janella Nelson for your points today.
And to our moderator. Did you guys enjoy that? All right. Do you want to see more? March 23rd, we're going to have our next event. I hope you can make it. It's going to be another great series of conversations. And of course, our festival is on June 2nd. If you like this, if you feel compelled to support this, feel free to text to donate. Here are all our wonderful sponsors who made it possible tonight. Thank you so very much for your time. Have a great night. Cheers, everybody.